The 50 geography lies you still believe about America. The geography lies you've always believed. You're about to realize your mental map of America is mostly wrong. I know that sounds dramatic, but trust me, the geography you think you know is built on half-truths, classroom distortions, and images you've seen your whole life that quietly lied to you. From the way Alaska looks massive next to Texas, to how states seem to fit together like neat puzzle pieces, it's all an illusion that began with how maps were drawn, colored, and simplified for kids. Some of these distortions were innocent, others served political or cultural agendas, and by the time you notice them, they've already cemented how you picture America in your head. Over the next 50 myths, we're going to rewrite that mental map together, one illusion at a time, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a US map the same way again. The map trickery we grew up with. Let's start with the first lie we all inherited, the Mercator projection. You've seen it 1,000 times, classroom maps with Alaska and Greenland looking like they could swallow entire continents. But here's the thing, those maps weren't designed to show countries at the right size. They were built for navigation. The Mercator projection stretches land near the poles, making northern regions look enormous so ships could travel straight lines on sea charts. On a globe, Alaska is big, but not half the continental US big. Greenland, it's about 1/14 Africa's size, yet on those old-school maps, they're almost equals. This wasn't just a scale issue, it warped an entire generation's sense of global and national proportion. Now let's talk about the supposed center of the continental United States. If you ask 5 people where it is, you'll probably get 5 different answers. The official marker is in Lebanon, Kansas, but even that's arguable because the center changes depending on whether you measure by landmass, population, or the inclusion of Alaska and Hawaii. Shift the math slightly, and suddenly you're dozens of miles off. It proves how much our sense of center, both geographically and symbolically, is just a definition game. Mapmakers in earlier centuries weren't neutral artists, either. Many exaggerated territories under colonial control to emphasize power or prestige. European cartographers enlarged the land they ruled, minimized rivals, and used color intensity to make empire borders pop off the page. The same principles slipped into American maps, too. Early maps often emphasized eastern states with ornate detail while leaving the western ones blank or vaguely defined, reinforcing the story that the East was civilized and the West wild until conquered. In short, maps doubled as propaganda as much as measurement. Then there's the myth of America's perfectly straight borders. On a high school wall map, states like Colorado and Wyoming look like perfect rectangles drawn with machine precision. In reality, none of them are truly straight. The Earth's curvature, combined with surveying errors from the 180s, means every straight border bends ever so slightly. The line between Utah and Colorado drifts, and even Kansas's southern edge isn't a perfect line. It shifts yards off from corner to corner. When surveyors worked with chains, compasses, and inconsistent meridians, precision was a luxury they just didn't have. Another invisible lie comes from color choice. Those bright, patchwork-style classroom maps that made one state yellow and another pink weren't just for fun. They subtly shaped how we perceive size and distance. By isolating states in distinct colors, mapmakers made each one look more like a floating entity than part of a connected system. You start thinking of Texas as a nation unto itself, or Oregon as distant from California, when in reality, ecosystems and economies flow across those artificial lines. Color coding trained our minds to separate rather than connect, turning a continuous landscape into a kaleidoscope of boundaries. And of course, there's projection politics, the quiet reason certain map styles dominated American classrooms. In the Cold War era, Western schools preferred the Mercator projection because it visually enlarged Europe and North America, signaling global dominance. Meanwhile, projections that gave accurate land area relationships, like the Gall-Peters projection, were labeled distorted or too political. Ironically, these were closer to physical reality. So when kids grew up seeing a map where the US looked massive and equatorial countries looked tiny, it wasn't just geography, it was ideology disguised as education. Maps are also lazy with scale symbols, leaving our brains to fill gaps. You see the Great Lakes on a wall map and imagine them tiny, when in truth, they form one of the world's largest freshwater systems. Alaska seems detached on its floating inset box, usually jammed under California somewhere, so people forget it extends farther west than Hawaii and north into the Arctic. Hawaii, meanwhile, floats like a casual island chain somewhere near Mexico, when in reality it spans a huge patch of the Pacific. The distortions of position make the US look smaller than it actually is, robbing it of its real global reach. The deeper you dig, the more you realize our maps are comfort tools. They were simplified to make America look tidy, rectangular, and balanced, something you can memorize and draw from memory. But geography isn't tidy. Rivers meander, coastlines shift, and the shapes we think we know, the flat top of Utah, the vertical line of New Mexico, are approximations at best. Even the proportions of the 48 states sitting side by side are off, because the map projection flattens a 3D space into 2D. Imagine pressing an orange peel flat. You'd have to stretch, tear, and squeeze it. That's basically what mapmakers did with the US. There's one more layer to the deception: direction. North is up is purely convention. Maps could just as easily be rotated so east or south points upward, but we've been conditioned to think of north as superior, upward, or dominant. This bias even sneaks into language. Think about the phrase, up north. Our sense of importance and progress literally aligns with the top of the map. So from the projection distortions to the invisible politics baked into school maps, the illusions pile up. America doesn't really look the way we think it does. Those clean grid lines we memorized were designed for memorization, not truth. Once you unlearn that, you start to see the real country: irregular, imperfect, alive with boundary quirks no map ever bothered to show. But the borders themselves carry even bigger misconceptions. Borders built on mistakes. Borders are supposed to be fixed, precise, lines that tell us what belongs where. But in America, many of those lines came out of errors, guesswork, and obsessions with symmetry that ignored the messy truth of the landscape. Some mistakes were tiny, a few feet off. Others rewrote entire state shapes. Let's start with one of the most famous and slightly embarrassing examples: the Four Corners Monument. You've seen it in photos, 4 states meeting perfectly at one spot, people lying across the lines to say they're in Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico all at once. The problem? That meeting point isn't exactly where the lines were supposed to meet. Due to surveying errors in the late 180s, the actual monument sits several hundred feet west of the right coordinate. According to law, though, the physical marker takes precedence, so that little circle of concrete, wrong as it is, legally defines the 4-way border. Think about that. The most symmetrical intersection in US geography exists because of an error that no one could justify correcting. Now jump north. Minnesota's northwest angle looks like a random puzzle piece someone forgot to trim off. It's this tiny wedge of land stuck above the 49th parallel, surrounded mostly by Canada and reachable by land only through Manitoba. How did that happen? It traces back to the 1783 Treaty of Paris, where negotiators relied on an outdated map that misplaced the region's lakes and rivers. They thought they were drawing along the source of the Mississippi River. It just didn't flow where they thought it did. When the real geography became clear, the border had already been committed to paper. By then, the US had inherited a miniature exclave completely cut off from the rest of the country unless you cross an international border. A map-reading mistake gave America one of its strangest quirks. Then there's the US-Canada border itself. On paper, it's this smooth horizontal line at the 49th parallel. In reality, it wiggles slightly through Idaho, Montana, and North Dakota because 19th century surveyors couldn't measure longitude with the precision we have today. Imagine walking across plains with a compass, a chain, and maybe a telescope, trying to stay aligned with an invisible coordinate circle running around the planet. The Earth isn't perfectly round either, so their instruments always drifted. The result is a border that technically bends back and forth across that ideal parallel. Even today, high-precision mapping shows tiny deviations. The line dances north and south by a few dozen feet in spots, silently forgiving generations of human miscalculations. We also need to talk about the myth of the one continuous wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. You've likely heard people describe it as if there's a single unbroken barrier stretching from the Pacific to the Gulf. The truth is far from it. There are fences, vehicle barriers, bollard walls, and long open gaps dictated by mountains, rivers, and private land ownership. In certain areas, especially along rugged terrain in Texas and Arizona, the Rio Grande itself forms the natural line, so a physical wall doesn't even follow the actual border path. That inconsistency means some U.S. land technically lies south of the barrier, an unintended geography glitch built by human convenience rather than political clarity. The famous borderline, in practice, is a complex patchwork of natural and man-made edges joined by legal interpretation. Farther east, confusion reigns on the Chesapeake Bay. People often assume Maryland owns the bay because its shoreline surrounds so much of it. But in reality, much of the central water belongs to Virginia, the line defined by colonial charters long before precise nautical surveying existed. The two states have been arguing over crab beds and oyster rights for centuries because the boundary was drawn before anyone could accurately map the bay's curves. Every shoreline shift from erosion or storm damage subtly redefines control yet again. What's even stranger, some bits of land that appear to hug Maryland's coast are actually Virginian due to historic definitions of mean low water mark. Geography evolved, but the legal borders refused to move. Surveying errors weren't rare in the early colonies, they were the norm. Those first boundary draws used magnetic compasses that didn't point to true north and chains that expanded in the sun. A single degree of error could slide a supposed straight line miles off course. Pennsylvania and Maryland fought literal wars, the border wars of the 176s, before the Mason-Dixon line finally settled the dispute. Even that landmark wasn't purely geographic. It combined astronomical observations, celestial alignment, and careful trigonometry. After completing it, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon still couldn't escape tiny inaccuracies from atmospheric distortion and measurement fatigue. Yet their imperfect result became one of the most symbolically powerful borders in North American history. You can see how these errors compound. A surveyor's deviation here, a treaty scribble there, and suddenly entire towns fall on the wrong side of a state line. Look at the Red River between Texas and Oklahoma. It's moved course several times due to flooding and erosion, occasionally transferring acres of farmland with it. The Supreme Court had to confirm that the border follows the river's shifting channel rather than the invisible line where it used to flow. So the land itself never agreed to our definitions, it constantly rewrites them. And these borders aren't just about mistakes, they reflect compromises. When the Louisiana Purchase was mapped, most of the territory's boundaries were defined long before anyone knew what the terrain looked like. Early drafts extended lines through mountain ranges no European or American had seen yet. The same happened with the Oregon boundary negotiations. The decision to follow the 49th parallel to the Pacific wasn't because it made sense geographically, it just looked neat on a piece of paper. In many ways, the straight borders across the West reflect 19th century bureaucratic aesthetics more than natural geography. They were human statements of order imposed on landscapes that don't bend neatly to human geometry. If you zoom into border towns today, you still find the ghosts of these mishaps. Roads that loop strangely before re-entering a state. Parcel maps where county lines slice through backyards. Even time zones follow some of those erroneous lines, causing spots like West Wendover, Nevada, to live on Utah's clock because of economic convenience. Geography's messiness seeps into daily life through these little practical fictions. What all of this shows is that borders are less about precise measurement and more about what societies agree to accept. The Four Corners marker stays the official intersection because removing it would confuse everything built on that illusion. The Northwest angle remains American because undoing a centuries-old treaty would trigger chaos. And the Chesapeake continues to flicker between two states depending on which survey you trust, but both govern around the uncertainty. So when we talk about US borders, we're really talking about collective stories that became law. The ground itself doesn't care, it shifts, erodes, and floods regardless of where people think the line lies. But our maps freeze time, locking in historical accidents as permanent truth. Every state outline you've ever traced hides a history of error corrected only by tradition. And once borders blurred like that, landmarks had to rewrite their own stories. Landmarks that don't stand where you think. If maps can lie, landmarks can too, and some of the most famous ones have been quietly bending the truth about where they actually stand. Let's start with one of the boldest illusions of all, the Statue of Liberty. Everyone knows it's in New York, right? Every postcard says so, but the statue actually stands within New Jersey's waters. Liberty Island sits on the New Jersey side of the state boundary line drawn through New York Harbor, yet it's legally under New York jurisdiction thanks to an 1834 agreement between the two states. So when you step off the ferry from Manhattan and think you've arrived in New York's proudest monument, you've actually landed on New Jersey land, governed as a New York enclave. Even today, this odd arrangement leads to confusion in law enforcement, mailing addresses, and occasionally bragging rights. It's a perfect example of how geography and politics rarely sync. Next up, the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, the shining symbol that's supposed to tower grander than anything else west of the Mississippi. At 630 feet, it's impressive, but here's the myth. It's not actually taller than many of the capital's monuments people instinctively compare it to. When you think of the arch, it seems massive enough to dwarf the Washington Monument or the Capitol Dome. But in reality, the Washington Monument stands just a few feet shorter, and the arch's exact dimensions, 630 by 630, were chosen for aesthetic symmetry, not scale competition. The illusion stems from its sleek shape and positioning on open land beside the river. The nearest structures are too far to give our brains any real reference point. It looks impossibly tall because nothing around it challenges the view. Then there's Mount Rushmore, carved faces everyone assumes must occupy the highest of high peaks. But the famous granite faces don't even sit near the highest elevation in the Black Hills. In fact, nearby Harney Peak, renamed Black Elk Peak, rises over 1,000 feet taller. When people see images of Rushmore, they imagine the carvings dominating the range, but they're placed on a relatively modest slope chosen for rock stability and lighting, not grandeur. The mountain was picked precisely because its orientation caught the right sunlight for most of the day, making the monument photogenic rather than topographically remarkable. So while Rushmore gets the glory, it's not even close to South Dakota's tallest point. Geography quietly takes a backseat to cinematic framing. Now let's compare canyons. Everyone loves to call the Grand Canyon the deepest in the US, but that title doesn't actually belong to it. It goes to Hell's Canyon, along the border of Oregon and Idaho. Hell's Canyon dives over 900 feet from rim to river, beating the Grand Canyon by nearly 2,000 feet in some spots. It's more remote, less photographed, and tougher to access, so the myth stayed alive that grand meant deepest. The difference between public perception and physical fact, tourism. The Grand Canyon became accessible by rail and later by car. Hell's Canyon never got the same investment. Marketing turned grandeur into synonym for height, and most people never checked the numbers. That brings us to the real culprit behind a lot of these misbeliefs: tourist marketing. Cities and states learned early that geography sells better when it sounds exceptional. Mount Mitchell's highest peak east of the Mississippi, for instance, is true, but only because the dividing line was chosen carefully. If you shift the metric to east of the Rockies, plenty of contenders suddenly appear. The same selective phrasing elevates small distinctions into grand claims. When you see plaques declaring world's largest, this or nation's first, that half the time the definition is buried in the fine print. The largest might only apply to a specific category, like largest freestanding dome east of the Mississippi, constructed before 195, which turns almost any landmark into a record holder if you phrase it narrowly enough. Tourist maps amplify this effect. Visit a gift shop in almost any state, and you'll find brochures declaring some sites as America's oldest, tallest, or only of their kind. But geography doesn't care about slogans. The southernmost point in the continental US sign in Key West, that concrete buoy marks an accessible spot, not the actual latitude extreme. The truly southern tip is on private Navy land a few hundred yards farther south, closed to the public. The sign remains uncorrected because it anchors visitors to a photo-friendly myth that sustains tourism. Even literal latitude gets negotiated when there's revenue at stake. Historic rivalries also fuel geographic distortion. States have spent decades competing to claim firsts or greatests in physical features. Take Niagara Falls. New York insists it owns America's piece of the natural wonder, but a good chunk of the iconic Horseshoe Falls actually sits on the Canadian side. Each nation angles its viewing platform to suggest full ownership, constructing visual dominance to offset technical boundaries. The same dynamic plays out with old mining towns along state edges, where tourism boards strategically crop maps to include nearby attractions within their region. Once marketing departments get involved, truth blurs into branding. I once talked with a park ranger in Arizona who explained this perfectly. He said, "People come here expecting to stand on the edge of history, but half of what they see was shifted by paperwork." Think about that. Entire landmark legacies depend on legal language more than geography itself. The Statue of Liberty's New York status, or the Arch's exaggerated height, or Rushmore's supposed elevation dominance, all crafted stories that feel right, yet collapse under measurement. But the public rarely cares. Emotional geography often wins over factual geography. And that emotional geography goes further than landmarks. It shapes state identity. New York's pride ties tightly to Liberty, Missouri's to the Arch, South Dakota's to Rushmore's faces. Redefine their true coordinates or proportions, and you threaten an entire narrative of belonging. That's why most of these inaccuracies persist. They serve cultural purpose. Correcting them wouldn't just rewrite maps, it would rewrite local pride. So the myths stay printed on postcards, and the real geography stays buried in survey data. Another fascinating layer is how camera perspective cements these illusions. The media learned early that shooting landmarks from selective angles can define how millions perceive their scale. The Grand Canyon's famous wide-angle photos emphasize depth by including foreground cliffs. Mount Rushmore is often photographed from below to make it seem mountainous. Liberty Island shots cut out neighboring Jersey shores to preserve the New York skyline illusion. These images repeat so often that they replace truth in collective memory. You could stand at the real site and still feel disbelief, seeing how modest some landmarks look outside their cinematic framing. Let's not forget landmarks that moved, literally. Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in North Carolina was relocated nearly 3,000 feet inland in the late 199s because erosion threatened to topple it. Yet many tourist maps still plot it in the original spot. Visitors stand with their phones, confused that the GPS pin doesn't match the monument before them. But the Park Service left the old foundations in place for historical continuity, creating a double vision effect, two official sites for the same landmark. Which one counts as the real lighthouse depends if you value original location or current survival. Again, fact and meaning diverge. Or take the Golden Gate Bridge. It's commonly described as linking San Francisco and Marin County. Technically true, but most of the bridge lies within San Francisco city limits. The Marin side begins halfway across. The midpoint boundary doesn't match where people imagine it. Even the Golden Gate name predates the bridge. It referred to the strait itself, named by explorer John C. Fremont decades before engineers ever planned a span. So the landmark took its name from the geography, then changed public understanding so completely that people now think the bridge created the name, not the other way around. This pattern repeats nationwide. Landmarks reshape the geography they were built upon, replacing natural context with simplified myth. When those myths prove profitable or emotionally satisfying, they get fossilized into curriculum, culture, and postcards. By the time you notice that the Statue of Liberty resides in New Jersey waters or that Hell's Canyon is deeper than the Grand, it hardly matters. Perception has long overtaken precision. The physical United States hosts one version of geography, but the America in our heads is sculpted by marketing, rivalry, and every flattering camera angle ever taken. Those landmark legends shaped entire state identities, and misinformation spreads fast. States that defy expectation. So you think you know your states. Texas is huge, Florida's the southern tip, Hawaii's way out west, and Maine clings to the far northeast. Sounds simple, right? Except almost every one of those assumptions hides a twist. Once you start comparing coordinates, distances, and real landmass, the United States turns into a geography puzzle that doesn't match the map in your head. Let's tackle the first size showdown most people get wrong: Texas and Alaska. For decades, Texans have bragged about being the biggest state, but that's because most maps compress Alaska into a smaller inset box, usually jammed under California or off the Pacific coast for convenience. The result? Your brain keeps seeing Alaska as roughly equal to Texas, when in reality, it's more than twice as large. Alaska spans about 665,000 square miles. Texas sits around 268,000. To visualize that, you could fit Texas inside Alaska 2 times and still have room for California. That's not subtle distortion, it's outright scale betrayal. Every classroom map that hides Alaska's full scope undercuts how enormous that state really is. Alaska's not just big on paper, it dominates in extremes too. It stretches farther north, west, and even technically east than every other state. Yes, east. That's because the Aleutian Islands cross the 180th meridian, meaning part of Alaska sits in the eastern hemisphere. On a globe, Alaska literally wraps around the top of the planet. But the floating box version you grew up with skipped that entirely, flattening its Arctic span into a tidy Pacific corner. Texas feels central partly because maps make Alaska look manageable, when in truth, it dwarfs every other boundary in sight. Now jump from those polar edges to the volcanic middle of the Pacific, Hawaii. You'll often hear that it lies entirely west of the continental United States. Not so fast. Draw a line on the globe, and you'll find parts of Alaska's Aleutian chain stretch farther west than Kauai or Oahu. And here's an even better twist. If you compare longitudes, Hawaii actually sits farther east than some spots on the lower 48's farthest western edges. The curvature of the Earth bends our expectations, the map just flattens them. When you fly from San Francisco to Honolulu, you think you're heading west because of the map's layout, but directionally, that route inches slightly south and a touch east before the Pacific's arc turns you toward the islands. The grid on paper lies, the globe never does. Now let's flip north. Look at Maine, the quiet top right corner of the country. People imagine it as modestly tucked below Canada's sweep, but geography says otherwise. Maine's northern tip actually reaches farther north than much of southern Canada. The city of Caribou, Maine, sits north of Montreal and even north of Toronto. Americans rarely consider that because of how political borders dominate mental maps. When you picture a US outline below Canada's vast expanse, your mind automatically assigns northness to Canadians and southness to Americans. But cross-reference latitudes, and Maine spikes above millions of Canadians' homes. Geography once again proves that perception follows drawings, not coordinates. Then there's Florida, the 24-degree latitude trickster. The concrete boy in Key West calls itself the southernmost point in the continental US. Tourists queue up for photos beside it, ignoring the fact that Hawaii rests dozens of degrees farther south. Honolulu sits near 21 degrees north, well below Key West's mark. Even within the continental divide, the Key West boy misses the actual extreme by a few hundred yards because military property blocks the true point. The beloved southernmost claim survives not because it's geographically rigorous, but because it fits on a postcard and draws crowds. The real southernmost piece of US soil belongs to the Big Island's Cartography, about 500 miles closer to the equator than Florida. The map in your head probably puts Hawaii much higher than it is, so this feels wrong, but the globe wins again. States in the West complicate things further because their neat borders changed after statehood, though those updates rarely make it onto modern maps. Take Nevada and California. Their shared boundary evolved through multiple surveys, correcting earlier misplacements. Early measurements accidentally tilted lines miles off intended meridians, then Congress quietly adjusted them without changing most printed resources. Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah claim to have simple right-angle corners, yet those shapes are illusions bred from two-dimensional rendering. Each corner bulges or curves slightly due to Earth's curvature and mistakes in longitude determination. The supposed symmetry of the four square states only exists in textbooks. the real survey markers reveal an uneven quilt of adjustments, nudges, and legal compromises. Then there's the forgotten east-west drift of western state borders. California's eastern boundary with Nevada was long thought to follow a meridian line precisely, but 19th-century surveyors using primitive instruments kept wandering off course as they crossed mountains. Some points along that line are several miles west or east of the intended coordinate. Maps smooth those inconsistencies to preserve aesthetic order, creating rectangles that never existed. It's geometry drawn by bureaucracy, not by terrain. Even oceanic boundaries defy expectation. Look at how far Florida stretches to the west compared with parts of the Midwest. Its panhandle reaches nearly to the longitude of Chicago. Meanwhile, parts of Maine extend east beyond any point of Florida, meaning sunrise reaches Maine first, while much of Florida's coast lags behind solar time. Yet most of us think of East Coast, meaning New York through Florida, in a nice straight strip. The coastline, however, curls and dips so drastically that calling it a single line is cartographic simplification bordering on fiction. If you look closely at state size rankings, more illusions emerge. Montana feels like one of the top 3 giants because of how it fills a rectangular space on the map, but California actually packs similar area with denser population because many classroom maps widen Montana slightly through projection stretch. New Mexico, often lumped as middle-sized, is larger than Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York combined, yet maps compress it for symmetry on standard poster formats. The more rectangular a state looks, the more misjudged its scale becomes. And remember those handy inset boxes for Alaska and Hawaii isolated below the contiguous map? Their placement does more harm than convenience. That design shrinks oceanic vastness, turning the Pacific and Arctic into small neighborhood ponds. In truth, Hawaii lies about 400 miles from California, farther from Los Angeles than London is from Istanbul. Alaska, if placed correctly on the same scale, would stretch the entire width of that classroom map, forcing designers either to reduce its scale drastically or to distort the entire poster. Instead of fixing the projection, educators opted for shortcuts. Over time, those shortcuts hardened into subconscious geography. Some state misconceptions come from outdated borders that no one ever visually corrected. Oklahoma once had its northern line drift slightly until GPS mapping clarified its offset. You'd never know from a textbook. Arkansas's curved Mississippi boundary has been redrawn at least twice due to river movement, yet every printed map still hugs the older trace. Even modern digital maps average the line into smooth arcs that no surveyor ever plotted. Every simplification teaches viewers to imagine precision that isn't real. State rearrangements after admission add another wrinkle. For instance, when Virginia split to form West Virginia, boundary surveys were rushed. Later geodesic corrections nudged the state's shape by small but significant margins. Colorado's southern edge was refined to align more neatly with New Mexico's northern surveys decades after both gained statehood. None of those tweaks appeared on school maps because publishers prioritized consistency over accuracy. That trade-off locked mistakes into cultural memory. Our perception of state shapes froze sometime between the 193s and 195s, ignoring later refinements. You can see this in how we describe locations psychologically. We call Colorado the center of the West, though the exact midpoint of the contiguous states drifts around Kansas. We think of the Dakotas as purely Great Plains, but western South Dakota actually lies within the mountain time zone and merges with the Rockies foothills. Every oversimplified regional label dilutes real variance, flattening 50 unique identities into color-coded generalizations. So why do these distortions stick? Because accuracy makes maps messy. Classrooms, logos, and highway souvenirs all prefer symmetry. If you drew Alaska true to scale next to Texas, it would dominate the image. If you placed Hawaii correctly, it would vanish off the page. Designers compromise clarity for convenience, and generations mistake convenience for truth. Those small choices shape national imagination. Think about how that affects self-image. Texans feel enormous, Hawaiians feel remote, Mainers feel isolated. Geography feeds identity, and identity resists correction. Tell someone from Florida they're not the farthest south, and they'll jokingly dismiss Hawaii as the islands. Mention Maine's latitude supremacy, and you'll get good-natured denial because emotional maps outvote factual ones every time. What all this means is that America's geography isn't just about boundaries, it's about the stories those boundaries tell. Each forgotten correction, every flattened inset, reinforces a simplified narrative of proportion that makes us comfortable. But once you see through it, the map transforms. Texas suddenly feels modest, Maine stretches surprisingly north, Hawaii slips eastward across your mental grid, and Alaska looms vast and unavoidable. And as states rewrote their borders, cities played their own illusion game. City myths that take you by surprise. Let's turn to the cities, where imagination, marketing, and cartography collide in the wildest ways. Everyone has a mental image of which American cities are the biggest, windiest, hottest, or most central, but nearly all those instincts come from slogans, not geography. Cities love to stretch the truth because civic pride demands something impressive to brag about. And over time, those bragging rights become accepted fact. Start with the largest city myth. Ask a random person which US city covers the most land area, and you'll hear New York, maybe Los Angeles. But the giant title doesn't belong to either. It belongs to places like Sitka, Alaska, and Jacksonville, Florida. Sitka's municipal boundaries spread over 2,800 square miles, larger than Delaware. Jacksonville sprawls across nearly 875 square miles, dwarfing New York's 300. That happened through annexation, not population. When Jacksonville merged with its surrounding county in the 196s, it inherited rural land and wilderness, instantly leaping to largest. So the map tells one story, the skyline tells another, and marketing blurs them together until big means whatever looks impressive on a billboard. Population myths follow the same pattern. Phoenix quietly leapfrogged cities like Philadelphia and Houston, but most people still picture the desert as a mid-tier metro. It's now the fifth largest US city, powered by decades of suburban annexation and relentless sprawl. Yet the illusion cuts both ways. Density remains low, so driving through parts of Phoenix feels emptier than older, smaller metros. The size illusion here flips. People underestimate Phoenix's population because the landscape feels thin, spreading 40 miles across instead of stacking vertically like Chicago or Boston. Sightlines hide statistics better than any marketing brochure. Speaking of Chicago, America's so-called Windy City. The phrase sounds meteorological, but it was originally political. Late century journalists used windy to mock local politicians for their boastful speeches, not the actual breeze. In truth, Chicago's average wind speed isn't exceptional. Several Midwestern cities outgust it annually. The nickname stuck anyway, reinforced by tourism campaigns after the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Corporations realized Windy City sounded dynamic, so they leaned on it shamelessly. Now every travel site repeats the myth as fact, and visitors pack extra jackets in July expecting Arctic gusts. Weather data quietly disagrees, but branding always wins. Kansas City carries another legend, that it sits near America's geographic center. Many signs and travel pamphlets still preach that, yet the real center rests in northern Kansas, near Lebanon, roughly 200 miles away. Kansas City earned the nickname through commerce, not coordinates. Railroads radiated from it, distributing goods coast to coast, so center of America made metaphorical sense. Over the years, metaphor blurred into geography, and now even highway rest stops repeat it uncorrected. The irony? Half of Kansas City isn't even in Kansas. Missouri hosts most of it. You can live in Kansas City, Missouri, and drive 10 minutes to Kansas City, Kansas, two separate municipalities joined by myth and marketing convenience. These myths persist because urban identity thrives on confidence. A city without an epic tagline risks invisibility in a crowded national psyche. Words like largest, central, or first sustain civic ego, but they also distort physical truth. Let's trace how that distortion started. In the late 19th century, as American cities competed for industry and railway access, boosters, early public relations figures, printed exaggerated claims to lure settlers and investors. Pamphlets promised mild winters in Minneapolis, coastal breezes in Dallas, and mountain health in Denver. few readers could verify any of it, so hyperbole sold faster than facts. Decades later, those phrases crept into official slogans and eventually geography lessons. Take Los Angeles. The myth paints it as an eternal sunshine paradise, bone-dry and beach-cooled. Reality, downtown L.A. averages fewer clear days than Phoenix and sits miles inland in a semi-arid basin that traps smog. Yet the tourism board built entire campaigns around the perfect climate fantasy, and maps reinforced it by coloring Southern California in warm pastels that screamed beach weather. Cartography literally supported the branding. Another shocker, Seattle's rain fame. It always rains there, people say, but total precipitation ranks lower than Houston, Miami, or New York. Seattle earns its stereotype from frequency of drizzle, not volume. Weather charts show many cloudy days with low totals, but because tourism photos emphasize umbrellas, the label stuck so firmly that even locals joke about it. Atmospheric nuance lost to cultural shorthand. These stories show how civic myths bleed into national perception, but there's a deeper reason they endure. Cities manipulate geography to define identity. Think about Las Vegas, positioned, quite dramatically, amid desert isolation. Maps exaggerate that isolation by coloring surrounding areas blank tan, yet in reality, suburbs sprawl into nearby mountains, and Lake Mead sits a short drive away. The veil of remoteness creates freedom mythology. Anything goes in the middle of nowhere. A half-truth becomes moral branding. Then there's San Francisco's Seven Hills legend. Official tourism still lists 7, echoing Rome's prestige, but a geological survey counts more than 40. Early boosters cherry-picked 7 for poetic parallelism, then labeled the rest differently to preserve the story. Even the name Bay Area manipulates perception. Few realize that the Bay system stretches far inland through the delta, connecting to cities dozens of miles from the iconic bridge. Maps cropped it smaller so it fit neatly inside poster edges. Now locals proudly say the Bay, as if it's one continuous water body, unaware that hydrologists divide it into multiple bays, sloughs, and estuaries. A recurring theme here is how small visual cues on maps skew our sense of distance within cities themselves. New York's borough map, designed for transit clarity, compresses Staten Island and inflates Manhattan, so the southernmost borough forever looks closer to Midtown than it is. That scaling error fuels the joke that nobody ever visits Staten Island. It seems right next door, yet feels worlds away because ferries distort temporal distance. Another example, Washington, D.C.'s geometry. The city's grid radiates from the Capitol, but the Potomac boundary cuts through, placing Reagan National Airport physically in Virginia. Passengers think they're landing in D.C., yet they touch down across the river. The airport code DCA perpetuates the mental fusion. Branding overrides jurisdiction facts. Then there's the eternal myth of coastal cities. Denver earns jokes about being landlocked, but it technically lies east of the Great Divide where river systems reach the Gulf of Mexico. Hydrologically, it connects to the sea. Meanwhile, inland ports along the Mississippi, Memphis, St. Louis ship goods worldwide, functioning more coastally than many ocean towns. But speak the words coastal influence, and you imagine surf, not rivers, proving how land perception favors spectacle over function. City slogans about direction also mislead. Portland, Oregon calls itself part of the Pacific Northwest, and most Americans accept that label. Yet if you overlay latitudes, Portland sits south of Toronto and north of Boston, aligning closer to Europe's latitude than Alaska's. The northern mystique sounds romantic. Accuracy spoils the brand. The emotional economy of these myths is powerful. People feel pride repeating them even after learning the correction. Tell a Chicagoan that it isn't the windiest city, and they'll grin, because the nickname now means character, not climate. Tell a New Yorker Jacksonville covers more ground, and they'll shrug. Density defines greatness, not acreage. Cities evolve beyond fact into legend. Still, these illusions shape how we interpret national geography. Because we anchor the American map by its cities, their myths ripple outward. When marketing inflates Phoenix's boom, we picture the Southwest expanding endlessly. When Windy City hype paints Chicago as icy and bustling, it colors our mental image of the entire Midwest. Each slogan distorts a region's psychology. Modern technology multiplies this effect. GPS apps flatten differences into identical pins. Social media tagging can make two cities thousands of miles apart share aura through filters and aerial shots. Miami sunsets look like Los Angeles ones online, erasing regional identity in favor of aesthetic myth, a new age cartography driven by pixels. Historically, that blur began with railways and newspapers. Now it's flight paths and hashtags. A Chicago influencer filming palm trees in Las Vegas can caption it, "Windy weekend getaway," merging cities, climates, and reputations seamlessly. Digital geography no longer needs to be real, it just has to be believable. And there's the practical fallout. Funding, tourism, and migration patterns all chase branded images. People move to Portland expecting endless rain and coffee culture. They find dry summers and wildfire haze. They relocate to Texas picturing open ranchlands, then land in suburban Dallas high-rises. When civic storytelling overshadows environment, newcomers experience cognitive dissonance, the awkward realization that slogans lie, geography doesn't. The deeper irony, none of this deceit feels malicious. Cities tell stories the way individuals do, selective truths polished for presentation. That's why these myths endure even after exposure. They serve belonging. A catchy nickname is easier to love than a data table of longitude and area. So the next time you hear a city boast about being America's heart, the biggest, or the windiest, pause before repeating it. There's likely a quiet caveat hiding under that headline. The largest might measure area, the windiest might measure pride, and the central might measure rails, not distance. Urban myths are our most persistent geography lessons, half fact, half aspiration. Beyond those urban legends, nature itself challenges every assumption we have. Nature's hidden geography lessons. Nature doesn't care about our neat lines and labels, and nowhere is that clearer than in America's wild topography. The natural landscape constantly exposes how limited our perception of geography really is. Mountains aren't where we think they are, rivers refuse to follow the script, and even the planet's quiet geological shifts rewrite the map under our feet. Let's unpack some natural lessons that break the myths we've been fed since grade school. Start with a towering misconception, literally. Most people assume Mount Rainier, the snow-capped giant visible from Seattle, dominates the nation's skyline. It certainly looks massive when framed by city buildings, but it's not the tallest in North America, nor even remotely close to Alaska's Denali. Denali rises to about 310 feet above sea level, while Rainier tops out around 14,410. The gap may not sound crushing until you hear this. From base to summit, Denali has a vertical relief larger than Everest's when measured from surrounding plains. Its base starts near 2,000 feet, so it shoots over 18,000 feet almost straight into the sky, a sheer wall of rock and ice taller than any other single peak on the continent. On most maps, though, Denali sits compressed or partly cut off by a box inset, stealing its scale entirely. If your mental model put the West Coast Mountains at the top of America's height list, nature just corrected you. Denali's dominance teaches a subtle truth: height depends on context, not just elevation numbers. Rainier looks huge because of its isolation. Denali looks average only because maps flatten Alaska's entire mountain system into a thin strip. The perception anchor isn't the mountain, it's the framing. When the frame changes, so does your awe. Now let's talk rivers. Ask almost anyone what the longest river in the United States is, and they'll reflexively say the Mississippi. It's the cultural icon, the mighty current splitting east and west. But in strict measurement, the Missouri River actually edges it out, stretching roughly 341 miles compared with the Mississippi's 340. Their confluence near St. Louis confuses the scorekeepers because some sources treat them as one system. Still, the Missouri technically wins. It snakes through 10 states, feeding the Mississippi rather than bowing to it. Yet textbooks simplify for storytelling. The Mississippi sounds grander, easier to pronounce, and fits neatly into the spine of America metaphor. The geography lesson here: scale often yields to symbolism. The river named first in history class replaces the longer one that doesn't rhyme so well in folklore. Speaking of rivers, consider what they reveal about geological patience. Every meander, loop, and oxbow visible from the sky shows a history much messier than any border line. The Mississippi alone shifts its path constantly through sediment buildup and overflow, yet our political system pretends those motions stop neatly at county lines. Nature keeps carving, legislation just redraws. If we could see time-lapse topography stretching back a few centuries, we'd realize that half of fixed America has quietly migrated a few feet every decade, especially along river valleys and coasts. Now pause on the Great Lakes, a set of water bodies so large they hide our next misconception. Michigan is the only state completely surrounded by them, that much most of us know, but the scale distortion is wild. The Great Lakes contain about 20% of the planet's surface freshwater, more than enough to submerge most European countries. You could drop the entire United Kingdom into Lake Superior and still sail around it. Yet standard maps shrink the lakes for convenience, compressing immense inland seas into mild puddles between Michigan and Canada. This compression fuels cognitive bias. People underestimate distance across them. From Detroit to the opposite Ontario shore is farther than from Paris to London, but because we call it a lake, we imagine weekend boat dimensions. Again, cartography undercuts nature's sense of magnitude. Not far away, in the interior west, another vast region contradicts expectations, the Great Basin. Many think of Death Valley as the ultimate symbol of American dryness, but the Great Basin extends that aridity across an entire swath of Nevada, Utah, and parts of Oregon and California. The term basin doesn't mean one low pit. It refers to an enormous area where no water reaches the sea. Every drop that falls there either evaporates or settles into salt flats. It's a self-contained world of drainage, stretching over 200,000 square miles. Within it, you'll find dozens of valleys as hostile as Death Valley, just less famous. If you remove the name tags from a satellite map, you'd realize that Death Valley isn't unique. It's part of a repeating pattern of endorheic basins shaped by rain shadows and volcanic legacy. The desert we treat as extreme is merely the most accessible example of an entire inland ocean system that dried out long ago. Speaking of volcanoes, the Cascade Range offers another hidden geography twist. When we picture American volcanoes, we imagine tidy cones along the Pacific edge, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, or Lassen Peak. In truth, the Cascade Volcanic Belt reaches deeper inland than people expect, extending through central Oregon into Idaho and even brushing northern Nevada with related geothermal fields. The pressure dynamics come from subduction zones far offshore, but their effects ripple inland hundreds of miles. So areas most tourists call high desert actually rest atop dormant or ancient volcanic structures. Many of the region's hot springs, obsidian deposits, and circular craters aren't coincidence. They're reminders that the continental crust still breathes beneath deceptively calm sagebrush plains. Volcanic geography also teaches humility about permanence. Mount St. Helens proved that in 198, when its eruption literally erased a mountain's top in a matter of hours. The peak lost 1,300 feet of elevation, and countless textbook illustrations became instantly obsolete. That's nature editing human assumptions in real time. Yet we still describe St. Helens as if frozen at that snapshot, ignoring how its lava dome continues rebuilding slowly year by year. Even mountains aren't static, they're verbs disguised as nouns. Another long-term lesson comes from tectonic drift. The North American plate slides westward a few centimeters each year, not much, but give it 1 million years and the Gulf of Mexico narrows, while California creeps toward Alaska. Geologists predict that if motion continues, Los Angeles could end up adjacent to San Francisco in tens of millions of years, a continental rearrangement that erases today's map entirely. What we think of as permanent national geography is temporary scaffolding balanced on migrating crust. Every valley, ridge, and coastal shape rewrites itself on geological schedule. Humans just happen to snapshot one frame. Nature also challenges our sense of elevation hierarchy. For instance, Colorado's Mount Elbert stands as the tallest point in the Rockies at 14,440 feet, but technically, it's lower than numerous Alaskan peaks outside the range altogether. Meanwhile, Mauna Kea in Hawaii surpasses them all when measured from base to peak. Its underwater roots make it about 33,500 feet tall, higher than even Everest by that definition. Yet because most of it hides below sea level, we crop its greatness from consciousness. Cartography records convenience, not completeness. When nature refuses the categories we use, we quietly adjust perception rather than the legend. Geology keeps playing long games with climate too. Regions once carved by glaciers serve as time capsules of movement. Montana's plains, for example, were scraped smooth by ice sheets that advanced miles thick, while neighboring valleys stayed lush because ice thickness varied by forest cover and altitude. The patchwork that remains tricks travelers into thinking topography equals soil fertility. In reality, the flat wheatlands are scars, and the rugged foothills nearby mark where glaciers stopped. Nature, not agriculture, drew those patterns. Humans just farmed within them. One of the biggest misunderstandings in American geography is the stability of landscapes themselves. We talk about the Rocky Mountains and think they've looked the same forever, but uplift continues. They grow, erode, and rebuild simultaneously. At the same time, slopes in the Appalachians, far older, continue shrinking, lowering their famous Blue Ridge by inches every millennium. These processes quietly shift watersheds, alter weather, and nudge state boundaries through erosion. So the earth beneath America never sits still. Every mountain state, or flat state, label reflects a fluid timeline more than a permanent descriptor. To grasp how deceptive stillness is, look to Yellowstone. Its caldera covers nearly 1,500 square miles of active magma chamber, an entire ecosystem living over a restless heartbeat. Every geyser pulse is a whisper from underlying forces powerful enough to change geography overnight. Scientists record ground swelling or sinking each decade by several inches, adjusting GPS coordinates accordingly. Yet the park map your visitor center hands you still assumes a fixed oval of land atop eternal rock. We navigate on certainty because it comforts us, not because it's true. All these examples share one pattern. Reality doesn't fit the grid. Denali dwarfs our expectations, rivers outgrow their reputations, lakes masquerade as puddles, deserts spread invisibly, volcano belts weave far inland, and tectonics redraw coasts while we sleep. The landscape undermines nearly every human attempt at tidy classification. Nature tells us, again and again, that geography isn't a static noun, it's a living process. And those geological processes never stop teaching. Every snowmelt carving new gullies in the Rockies, every fault tugging silently under California, every dune shifting in Nevada, all are lessons in impermanence. The mapmakers may freeze frames for textbooks, but the planet prefers fluid motion. When we mistake the snapshot for the story, we misunderstand the country itself. Geography, like history, is ongoing. Now let's follow the water, where the biggest illusions meet the coast. Coastlines and water myths. America's edges are where the grandest illusions meet the real world. Coastlines that never stay still, seas that stretch far beyond our awareness, and rivers that refuse to divide the nation as cleanly as maps suggest. We grow up with tidy contours tracing the edge of the land, blue lines for rivers, and dotted treaty marks for maritime zones. But water is trickster geography. It moves constantly, mocks boundaries, and hides truths that we rarely question. Let's start with a stunning fact. Alaska's coastline is longer than all other US states combined. If that stopped you for a second, you're not alone. Almost no one imagines it that way. Alaska boasts around 33,000 miles of shoreline when you count every bay, fjord, and island curve. Add up the rest of the nation, California, Florida, Maine, and every other coastal state, and they still don't match it. Yet classroom maps compress Alaska into a little box, robbing it of scale and fractal complexity. Coastline measurement itself exposes how deceptive maps can be. The length changes depending on how detailed you measure, a phenomenon known as the coastline paradox. The closer you zoom, the longer it becomes because every notch and inlet adds new miles. So Alaska's massive tally isn't even constant. It's a reminder that our attempts to quantify nature's edges never quite catch up to reality. Move a little west or east, depending on your globe orientation, and you'll hit another oversight. The United States actually touches the Arctic Ocean. Most people envision America bounded by the Pacific and Atlantic plus the Gulf of Mexico, but Alaska's northern coast faces directly into the Arctic. The community of Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, sits on that frigid shore, literally at the top of the planet. where the sun disappears for months and reappears for months more. Calling America a temperate country ignores this frozen frontier. The omission isn't small, it shapes foreign policy, climate science, and maritime law. Because sea ice once blocked navigation, old textbooks simply skipped that region, treating it as lifeless blank space. But as the Arctic opens, those neglected coastlines suddenly matter. The US isn't a two-ocean nation, it's a three-ocean one: Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic. Now follow that Arctic meltwater south, and we hit the myth of the Mississippi Divide. People picture the Mississippi River slicing America cleanly into an east and west half, as if the line cuts the country neatly down the middle. But statistically and geographically, it doesn't. The river flows southward through the central corridor, but the landmass west of it is about twice as wide as the land east of it. In population, climate, and elevation, the divide is symbolic at best. Even the watershed boundary is complicated. The Missouri River drains half the Great Plains before joining the Mississippi, so much of western rain ends up flowing east. The tidy divide idea exists because humans like balance in their metaphors. Geography isn't balanced, it's opportunistic. And that lopsidedness feeds another misconception about America's heartland. While we see the Mississippi as an anchor, it's a wandering creature. The river routinely moves its channel, forming oxbows that cut towns off overnight. In some places, old highway markers to East Bank counties now sit west of the current flow. The nation pretends to sit fixed, but water keeps redrawing internal maps. If our school atlases updated annually, we'd have dozens of small new islands appearing and vanishing within the floodplain. The illusion of permanence is probably our biggest water-based delusion. Speaking of shifting, consider Utah's Great Salt Lake, the inland sea that gave a state its defining name. Its title feels eternal, yet the lake has been shrinking for decades. Climate change, diversion of feeder rivers, and evaporation have reduced it to barely a third of its historical volume. Satellite photos show exposed lake beds stretching outward like scars. The great part is increasingly metaphorical. But because we inherited the name from explorers who sailed its deeper past, we speak of it as if it still dominates the region. You can drive to beaches listed in 20th century guidebooks and find nothing but dust. Names freeze in time while geography continues marching. And the Great Salt Lake isn't alone. Thousands of American place names on a vanished water. Dry Lake, Dead Sea, and Lost River appear across dozens of states, remnants of temporary bodies that once justified entire towns. Yet maps rarely reflect those disappearances. When we say the map is not the territory, this is what it means. Cartography immortalizes moments nature erased. Water's constant motion makes liars out of cartographers every year. Next, the Gulf Stream, the invisible highway of warm water streaking north along the east coast. You've probably heard that it keeps Florida warm or makes the east mild. That's partially true, but the common explanation oversimplifies. The Gulf Stream's strongest influence lies far offshore. It augments northern climates more dramatically than southern ones. It actually helps moderate temperatures in Europe far more than in North America. Yet curricula often cite it as the Atlantic warmth engine for the eastern seaboard. In reality, prevailing wind patterns and the continental shelf do as much work as the current itself. The myth persists because it feels logical: warm current equals warm coast, but meteorology rarely aligns so neatly. When we talk about coastlines, politics slips back in. Maritime boundaries, those faint dotted arcs extending outward from land, follow international rules like the exclusive economic zone stretching 200 nautical miles. On paper that sounds like firm geometry, but in practice currents and tides blur them daily. Alaska again complicates this because its islands scatter deep into the Bering Sea, overlapping potential Russian claims. Out there, a shift of a few yards in sea ice can technically alter jurisdiction lines worth billions in minerals or fish stock. So even ownership floats on moving water. We draw it firm, nature erases it softly. Another classic coastal misconception, that the US shoreline faces only open ocean. Technically, the Gulf of Mexico isn't part of the Atlantic, but a semi-enclosed sea ringed by the US, Mexico, and Cuba. Its currents loop in circles, the loop current, unlike the linear Atlantic drift we imagine. This distinction matters because oil drilling, hurricane paths, and climate models rely on those enclosed dynamics. Still, we call the Gulf Atlantic coast out of convenience, erasing the unique body of water that powers entire ecosystems and industries. And if you trace the Gulf northward, you hit something surprising. Coastlines change fast enough to make atlases obsolete within a decade. In Louisiana alone, erosion and sea level rise claim roughly a football field of land every hour. That's not figure of speech, it's measurable loss. Communities that once sat inland now watch marshes become bays. Barrier islands wink out between hurricane seasons. Yet the printed map, the one you maybe saw at school, still shows firm deltas stretching outward. The mismatch illustrates how we imagine geography like architecture, solid, known, built to last. But a coastal map is more like a photograph of a wave. You capture motion, pretending it's structure. Maine tells the opposite story, a coastline swelling not by loss but by definition. Depending on measurement scale, Maine's coastal length rivals California's. All those jagged peninsulas and hidden coves multiply when counted at high resolution. Zoomed out, the line looks simple. Zoomed in, it's a labyrinth of bays and islands. For sailors, that complexity means shelter and danger in equal measure. For mapmakers, it means headaches. No two agencies agree on Maine's exact coastline length because it changes with every glacier-carved indentation included or skipped. So even how long is America's coast has no definitive answer. It's like asking how long a piece of coral is. Let's take a quick detour inland again. The idea that rivers define certainty. Historically, that's why early settlers relied on them for borders. They seemed stable. But any hydrologist will tell you rivers migrate. The Rio Grande, for instance, wriggles constantly, carving new meanders that sometimes place American soil on the Mexican side. Treaties fix the border to the mid-channel, but when the channel drifts, confusion erupts. There are ranches fenced on both sides that technically swap countries after a major flood. You won't see those nuances on a globe. Those blemishes offend tidy design. And that design culture infects public understanding. Coastlines are redrawn to fit rectangles, islands shrink to dots, continental shelves vanish. The truth is, the United States stretches far into the ocean through those shelves, submerged territory larger than several states combined. Yet we mentally truncate it at the waterline, surrendering half the country's geological fingerprint to invisibility. It's a form of denial, out of sight, out of map. So what's the takeaway from all these watery lies? That every blue patch you see on a map hides motion, impermanence, and political storytelling. Alaska's endless coast dwarfs our assumptions. The Arctic quietly crowns the nation with an oceanic border most forget exists. The Mississippi doesn't divide anything cleanly. It dances through farmland like liquid handwriting. The Great Salt Lake shrinks while its greatness lingers in name. The Gulf Stream doesn't warm what we think it does, and the very edges of the U.S. advance and retreat with every storm surge. Our national outline looks stable on screen, but it breathes, waves chew at it every second. Coastlines remind us that geography is ongoing negotiation, not fixed truth. And if water keeps rewriting America's shape, maybe that's fitting. After all, the country's identity has always been fluid too. But America's strangest geography distortions come straight from history itself. History that rewrote geography. If coastlines prove nature keeps editing the map, history shows people did it first, on purpose, by accident, or through pure stubborn imagination. Every textbook map you grew up with doesn't just show land and water, it freezes political arguments, propaganda, and compromises that turn temporary lines into lasting myths. America's geography owes as much to human storytelling as to plate tectonics. Let's start with one of the most popular lies in casual conversation. Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp. Tour guides repeat it, comedians love it, and politicians use it as metaphor. But it's not true. The capital rose along the Potomac's lowlands, yes, but explicit swamp, hardly. Historical surveys show the region consisted mainly of tidal flats, marshy meadows, and patches of higher ground with solid clay soil. Engineers drained and leveled sections for the mall and monuments, yet most of the terrain was never knee-deep muck. The myth stuck because early detractors mocked the humid summers and mosquito clouds, then writers adopted swamp as poetic shorthand for corruption. Over centuries, metaphor hardened into memory, and now the literal geography of the capital is mythologized beyond recognition. The only swamp that truly endured was rhetorical. That swamp rumor hints at a broader historical pattern. When Americans reorganized land, they rewrote nature too. The colonial borders of the 13 states didn't resemble today's tidy outlines. Take Virginia, it once stretched all the way to the Pacific by charter because no one really knew where the Pacific was. Maps drawn in London exaggerated territorial ambitions into horizontal bars spanning the continent. Actual settlements hugged the Atlantic, but paperwork claimed deserts and mountains unknown to Europeans. When later surveys revealed the planet's curve and continental width, those phantom claims collapsed. Each correction carved new states from the overstretched originals, from Kentucky to Illinois to West Virginia. What we call state borders were literally admissions of previous ignorance. You can trace those corrections through century-old maps that barely agree with each other. Early New England boundaries leaned on vague references like the headwaters of certain rivers. Problem: rivers move. The Old North boundary of Massachusetts wavered by miles once geographers realized the Merrimack snaked south before turning east. Towns found themselves switching states without moving an inch. It wasn't malicious, it was cartographic lag. Long before GPS, colonial geography depended on rumor and incentive. Surveyors hired by rival governments often found results favorable to whoever paid better. And then there's the Mason-Dixon line. Everyone recognizes it as the symbolic divider between North and South, free and slave, Union and Confederacy. But as a physical border, it's meaningless beyond marking part of Pennsylvania's and Maryland's edge. The line we discussed today absorbed cultural weight far beyond what its creators intended. Mason and Dixon completed their work in the 176s to end a land dispute, not to define morality. Yet by the Civil War, that survey became shorthand for America's deepest social fracture. Geography didn't draw the divide, politics projected one onto latitude and longitude. That's the ultimate proof that maps double as mirrors, showing what a society chooses to see in itself. History littered the map with similar symbolic ghosts. Route 66, for instance, the Mother Road, the promised line west to opportunity. People still trace its path nostalgically from Chicago to Santa Monica, believing it mirrors Manifest Destiny's arc, but large portions deviate from the original course. Highway realignments in the mid-century cut dozens of towns out of the route. Later, when the interstate system overtook it, whole stretches vanished into farmland. Tourist brochures map a continuous line that no longer exists. The myth prevails because Route 66 isn't just asphalt, it's an emotional geography representing freedom better than any accurate GPS track could. As with so many American places, what it meant outweighed where it was. That principle, meaning over measurement, has defined the national map since its inception. Early classrooms in the 19th century didn't just teach geography, they taught patriotism. Many school atlases deliberately exaggerated U.S. size relative to the world, coloring the country in bright expanses while muting foreign land. Smaller neighboring nations appeared shrunken or faded, implying destiny and dominance. Labels like Indian Territory sprawled over multi-state regions, oversimplifying complex sovereign lands into cartoon placeholders. Those maps weren't neutral, they were propaganda tools training generations to perceive expansion as natural progress. Even the decorative borders, filled with eagles and flags, told children which direction greatness traveled, westward. Sometimes the distortions were subtler. During westward expansion, cartographers often labeled blank spaces unexplored, erasing indigenous occupancy entirely. Unexplored to whom? Certainly not to the nations already living there. By naming emptiness, mapmakers justified claiming it. The map itself became an instrument of conquest, converting inhabited ecosystems into potential property. Later, when reservations were drawn, boundaries rarely matched ecological or cultural regions. They followed latitude, rivers, or railroad lines because those looked tidy on paper. Centuries of misrepresentation shrink cultures into margins, literally and ideologically. Speaking of ideology, consider how Civil War and Reconstruction politics reshaped geographic memory. Textbooks in different states published different maps of the same events, Union editions shaded seceded states in dull gray. Confederate sympathizers shaded them proudly distinct. Even decades after reunification, Southern map publishers continued printing versions that emphasized regional autonomy, while Northern books flattened differences to imply inevitable unity. Consequently, what America looked like varied depending on which classroom you sat in. Historical cartography wasn't about coordinates, it was a contest over whose story owned the canvas. Then there's the strange legacy of imaginary territories that kept lingering long after they were gone. Look at the state of Franklin in the 178s or the Jefferson Territory near the Rockies. These short-lived proto-states appeared on some maps for years after dissolving because engravers reused old plates. They literally couldn't afford to start fresh. Printing economics fossilized obsolete geography, leaving schoolchildren decades later to wonder about ghost states that never officially joined the Union. Even now, you'll see vintage posters with borders that include unrecognized regions. They're charmingly inaccurate, but they illustrate how slow information once traveled. Technology eventually narrowed those gaps, but myths adjusted instead of disappearing. The invention of railroad maps spawned new distortions. Routes curved gently to suggest smooth travel even when they twisted violently through mountains. Builders wanted investors, not vertigo. Early airline route maps exaggerated arcs to appear global, turning coast-to-coast flights into sweeping diagonals that seemed heroic. Geography bent to commerce again. Every transportation leap redrew mental distance. The continent shrank emotionally long before it did physically. Historical geography also played favorites with edges of the country. For centuries, maps lopped off Alaska and Hawaii entirely or pushed them into margins, reinforcing continental bias. That practice wasn't logistical only, it reflected the politics of inclusion. Territories appeared like bonus features rather than integral land. Pacific holdings such as Guam or American Samoa often vanished altogether, deemed irrelevant to the Maine nation. The habit persisted because the narrative of a compact continental America felt cleaner for classrooms and propaganda. Accuracy fell victim to storytelling unity. Even scientific mapping carried biases. Early geological surveys sometimes smoothed out inconvenient formations that challenged existing theories. For instance, 19th-century atlases omitted evidence of volcanic mountains in the eastern states because mainstream geologists doubted such activity existed there. When data later confirmed ancient eruptions, the public barely noticed. The maps had already sculpted a permanent perception of the East as stable and old. Once again, history wrote over geography and then refused the revision. What's remarkable is how many of these historical distortions endure in popular culture. We still say, across the Mississippi, as shorthand for venturing west, even though highways and demographics long blurred that transition. We still color Texas red deserts and Maine pine green, echoing textbook palettes chosen a century ago. Graphic decisions from print presses define emotional climate as effectively as meteorology does. There's also the paradox of naming itself. Many state and city names fuse languages and stories collected through centuries of misunderstanding. Take Dakota, derived from a Sioux word meaning ally or friend, attached to territories that displaced its original speakers. Or California, drawn from a 16th-century Spanish novel describing a mythical island paradise. The names we repeat sound geographic, but are literary by birth, and those literary roots welded fantasy into official lexicon. The very vocabulary of U.S. geography stems from conflating fiction with terrain. Even measurements became patriotic performance. During the 19th century, surveyors timing cross-country expeditions exaggerated toughness to romanticize the frontier. Their reports described hostile wildernesses, virgin lands, and discovery, ignoring indigenous mapping systems predating them by millennia. Native trail networks formed the skeleton of future highways, yet official histories credited European explorers for charting them. The mapping of America, in many ways, was an act of unmapping cultures that preceded it. By the 20th century, propaganda simply changed tone. World War II training maps expanded the U.S. portion of the hemisphere visually to emphasize modernization and might. Cold War globe models inflated North America's size relative to the Soviet Union. These distortions aimed at morale and identity, not deception, yet they left residue of misunderstanding that survives in modern mental maps. Ask someone to draw the world from memory, and they'll likely produce an America too big and an Africa too small. History's visual confidence still dictates spatial imagination. The pattern behind every example is identical. Maps follow power. Whoever holds authority decides which borders harden and which fade. Political victories finalize lines, but outdated versions linger wherever they serve nostalgia or ideology. That's why these errors persist. Acknowledging their artifice would unravel national myths we rely on for coherence. When painters finish a canvas, they sign it, but mapmakers rarely do, leaving anonymity that disguises authorship. So generations forget that America's shape wasn't discovered. It was designed, disputed, and repeatedly redrawn. From colonial charters stretching to imaginary oceans, to moral lines reinvented as geographical divisions, to highways memorialized long after rerouting, history never merely recorded geography, it composed it. And after history changed the map, even the extremes lost meaning. Section 9. Myths of the American Extremes. When someone asks where America's farthest points lie, it's north, south, east, and west. It seems like an easy question, but simple geography questions about extremes tend to reveal the deepest misconceptions. The truth is, nearly every map you've seen hides how weirdly stretched and counterintuitive the United States really is once you leave the mainland and look at the full globe. Let's start north, because that one catches almost everyone off guard. The northernmost U.S. point isn't in the continental 48, it's in Alaska, inside a small community at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, sits at about 71 degrees north latitude. That's farther north than Reykjavik, Oslo, or most of Siberia's populated zones. If you think of the U.S. as sitting entirely in the temperate zone, this fact alone dismantles the myth. You can stand on American soil that experiences 24-hour darkness in winter, illuminated only by the aurora. The lower 48 never see that reality, so people unconsciously erase it from their identity of the nation. Now pivot west, where cartographic illusion really tests logic. Most of us would confidently point to the Aleutian Islands to mark the western frontier, and we'd be right, but not in the way we expect. Because those islands cross the 180th meridian, part of Alaska officially lies in the Eastern Hemisphere. That means the United States is both the westernmost and easternmost country relative to the global coordinate system. Wrap your head around that one. On a wall map that stops at the Pacific seam, America looks cut off from itself, but on the actual globe, it loops around. The international date line even zigzags purposely to keep the islands on one national calendar. Otherwise, two American communities would live a day apart. The continental image of the U.S. as a single tidy block, sliced by longitude, collapses completely once you include that overlooked arc of islands. The easternmost point, surprisingly, is also Alaskan, at least by coordinate. Point Udall in Guam often gets mistaken for it because of the international date trick, but in pure longitude, Alaska's Semisopochnoy Island extends past 179 degrees east, across the hemispheric divide. In cultural shorthand, east usually means the Atlantic side, yet the true eastern tip points into rough Pacific seas closer to Russia than to New England. These contradictions arise because our flat maps place degrees longitude in Britain, slicing the Pacific down the middle. The human convention bends the U.S. into dual hemispheres. Every classroom Mercator projection hides that, reinforcing the illusion that the nation's edges stop at California's coast. Swing south and another assumption falls apart. Florida is not the nation's southernmost point. We've mentioned Key West's buoy before. It marks the extreme for the continental U.S., not the entire country. The genuine southernmost U.S. latitude sits in Hawaii, on the Big Island's tip called Ka-Li, or South Point, at roughly 18 degrees 55 N. It's nearly 5 degrees closer to the equator than Key West. On an accurate world map, those degrees translate to about 345 miles of difference. Yet our mental image of America keeps the islands hovering higher on the Pacific, Maybe because designers crop them above the Tropic of Cancer for tidy spacing. That omission turns a tropical archipelago into a mid-latitude afterthought. Even stranger, several U.S. territories, like American Samoa, dip farther south still, resting below the equator entirely, but we rarely mention them when discussing national extremes. That leads directly to the Hawaii Hemisphere myth, the belief that at least part of Hawaii crosses the equator or belongs to the southern hemisphere. It doesn't. Every Hawaiian island sits clearly north of the equator, between 18 and 23 degrees. The confusion stems from how stretched maps substitute latitudinal curvature for aesthetic layout. Because the chain drapes diagonally across rectangular projections, viewers imagine it extending past that invisible middle line. Textbooks occasionally reinforce the error by shading the ocean background symmetrically, showing the equator through mid-Pacific but forgetting scale. The result? Generations convinced that palm trees their straddle hemispheres. Temperature myths feed similar errors. Take Death Valley, branded as Earth's absolute oven. It holds the U.S. record at 134 degrees F, 1913, at Furnace Creek, and for a long time that value was treated as global champion. However, modern verification has challenged it, and several Middle Eastern basins occasionally rival or exceed that. Even within North America, Death Valley isn't always the current leader. Mexicali and parts of the Sonoran Desert sometimes out-heat it seasonally. The record persists mainly because early measurements there coincided with a period of global curiosity and because the name sells. Ask someone to name America's coldest spot, and they'll likely guess somewhere in Minnesota. In truth, it's Prospect Creek in Alaska, clocking 80 degrees F decades ago, yet that fact rarely surfaces in popular imagination. Extremes survive by memorability, not by continued accuracy. Another curiosity emerges when towns brag about being the geographic center of the United States. There are, depending on what you include, at least 3 credible claims. The traditional marker near Lebanon, Kansas, represents the 48 states midpoint. Add Alaska and Hawaii, and the balance point jumps northwest to near Belle Fourche, South Dakota. Factor in outlying territories like Guam and Puerto Rico, and the centroid drifts far across the Pacific. Each adjustment redefines center, by which pieces of the puzzle you count. Signs along Kansas Highway 281 still proclaim center of the nation, because updating them would admit that the heart has moved, something communities resist. Our longing for a fixed middle outruns mathematical reality. These shifting definitions reveal something philosophical. Geography's extremes only exist within chosen frames. When America expanded overseas, few citizens mentally adjusted their compass. Guam, roughly 6,000 miles from California, suddenly became the westernmost patrimony, yet it almost never appears on classroom maps drawn within continental bounds. The same invisibility affects the U.S. territories in the Caribbean and Pacific. The average American's concept of national extent ends at Hawaii's beaches, ignoring that the nation stretches longitudinally halfway around the globe. That oversight makes the country seem smaller and less globally entangled than it truly is. Ignoring those territories also skews perception of time. Because the U.S. spans the 180th meridian, it encompasses every hour of the day simultaneously. Some American islands wake up while others cross into tomorrow. The international dateline's bends keep administrative sanity, but conceptually, the United States occupies the most expansive time reach of any country on Earth. You could board a plane on one American island, fly east, and land the previous day. Few realize that because daily life operates inside continental schedules, time geography feels theoretical when reality adheres to 90-minute domestic flights. Territorial amnesia influences patriotism too. When media refer to the nation's corners, they almost always mean points on the mainland, the tip of Florida, the rocky edge of Maine, Washington's Pacific Bluff, and Minnesota's northwest angle. Yet legally, each of those corners faces another farther corner hidden over ocean. America's true northern tip sits inside Arctic pack ice. Its westernmost point gazes across the date line. Its southern reach brushes equatorial currents. Its eastern limb, paradoxically, looks out from that same Alaskan island chain towards sunrise. The symmetrical, postcard-ready rectangle of America disintegrates in a single global rotation. Then we have climate and altitude extremes twisting common language. Mount Elbert may be the Rockies' peak, but Denali reclaims continental leadership with an altitude variation so vast that its base to summit stretch exceeds Everest's. Conversely, the lowest U.S. point, Badwater Basin at 282 feet, sits less than 80 miles from Mount Whitney, the contiguous United States' highest. Within a morning's drive, the country's highs and lows coexist. Yet people imagine grandeur spread evenly west to east, rising gently toward a central backbone. In truth, America's relief resembles a chaotic heartbeat, spiking where tectonics still rumble and plummeting where plates pull apart. The extremes cluster tightly, mocking our phrasing about the heartland and coasts. It's worth noting that measurement itself introduces illusions. Determining highest or lowest depends on whether you count sea level, local base, or planetary radius. Because Earth bulges at the equator, mountains near it technically sit farther from the planet's center, even if shorter in elevation. That quirk means Chimborazo in Ecuador outranks Everest in distance from Earth's core. Within American context, the same principle nudges Hawaiian volcanoes slightly outward, giving them cosmic bragging rights invisible on typical charts. Geography rewards nuance, we settle for headline numbers. Every myth in this set, north versus south, east versus west, hottest versus coldest, center versus edges, comes from our craving for symmetry. We like neat opposites, northern wilderness balancing southern tropics, eastern dawn answering western dusk. Real geography rarely cooperates. The US occupies such a spread of latitude and longitude that it defies the box boundaries we are trained to recite. The nation's eastern frontier crosses west of its western one. Its warmest tropics coexist with its near-Arctic deserts. Its yesterday sits next to its tomorrow. Once you absorb that every superlative sounds provisional, the northernmost, deepest, or center titles shift with definitions, politics, and perspective. America isn't a balanced rectangle, it's a planetary sprawl stitched together by myth and convenience. The next time someone insists they've reached the country's edge, ask them, which one? Because if you count every island, reef, and frozen shore, the correct answer is all of them, all at once. Once you realize that, the mainland is only part of the story. America beyond the mainland. Here's where most Americans' mental map hits its limit, the assumption that the country neatly ends at 50 states. But that boundary leaves out a whole realm of US geography scattered across oceans, coral atolls, and remote territories that reshape what America actually means on the globe. This final stretch exposes just how incomplete our maps and our education really are. Start with the territories everyone's heard of yet rarely picture accurately: Puerto Rico, Guam, and American Samoa. Each sits thousands of miles from the continental US, yet all operate under American sovereignty. Puerto Rico lies in the Caribbean, roughly 1,000 miles east of Miami, but culturally and legally it lives in limbo, an organized but unincorporated territory whose residents are US citizens yet lack full voting representation. Most maps crop it out completely or toss it into a tiny island cluster near Florida, making it look like a short hop away. In truth, flying from New York to San Juan takes the same time as to South America. When an entire island's distance is flattened like that, its global significance slips out of view. Head west across the Pacific, and the distances stretch imagination. Guam sits near the Mariana Islands, closer to Manila than to Honolulu. It's over 6,000 miles from California, a US community that wakes up when the mainland is still yesterday. Despite its remoteness, its strategic military importance is enormous, hosting bases central to Pacific defense logistics. Yet textbooks traditionally ignore Guam, as if American geography stops before reaching the Philippine Sea. To include it properly, classroom globes would have to display half the Pacific Ocean, a cartographic inconvenience few printers accept. The result? Guam remains functionally invisible in public consciousness. Then there's American Samoa, unique even among territories. It's the only US possession south of the equator. That means part of America literally lies in the southern hemisphere, experiencing opposite seasons from the mainland. Its residents aren't born US citizens but nationals, another legal nuance rarely acknowledged when we talk about American identity. Culturally Polynesian, geographically isolated, American Samoa challenges every idea the average American holds about where their country ends. Yet because maps center the continental US, this island cluster often lands off the visible page. When the edge of the paper defines national borders, outposts disappear. Those aren't all. The US maintains jurisdiction over multiple minor Pacific islands, often uninhabited atolls like Howland, Baker, and Jarvis, the Johnston Atoll, Midway Atoll, Palmyra Atoll, and Kingman Reef. Each carries obscure statuses, some wildlife refuges, others military reserves or scientific posts, but together they spread the American footprint across thousands of square miles of ocean. Howland Island, for instance, once appeared in Amelia Earhart's flight plan. Baker Island sits near the equator west of it. None host permanent populations, yet under international maritime law, they extend America's exclusive economic zone outward by hundreds of miles. These slivers of coral generate immense oceanic territory, millions of square miles of water, rights unseen on basic atlases. So when people describe the United States as continental, they unintentionally delete the biggest portion of its sovereign reach. Midway stands out historically. Though small, barely 2 square miles above water, it became a decisive World War II battleground, altering the Pacific's balance of power. Its victory established the narrative of America's Pacific presence, yet post-war maps demoted it back to a dot. That dot defines global logistics routes, but the public sees an empty blue field. Scale isn't the only illusion, it's significance by erasure. Our maps whisper that these islands barely matter, even as international treaties hinge on them. Submerged outposts add another layer of confusion. Under the law of the sea, nations can claim continental shelf extensions beyond visible shorelines if geological evidence proves continuity. For the US, that includes undersea ridges off Alaska, the Atlantic coast, and island territories. These undersea provinces are invisible to even the most detailed printed maps, yet they're legally America just as much as any farm in Kansas. In theory, someone standing on a research submersible thousands of feet below the Pacific might technically be under US jurisdiction. When geopolitical maps omit vertical dimension, they only show half the nation's breadth. So why did all these territories vanish from education, simplicity, and politics? After Alaska and Hawaii gained statehood in 1959, schools and publishers locked in the tidy 50 stars equals 50 states narrative because it packaged identity easily. Territories didn't fit the celebratory rhythm of state equality, so they faded into footnotes. When you look at old globes labeled 50 great states, the phrase itself erases millions of American citizens and island acres. The mainstream mental map froze right before the margin of the page, literally trimming reality. That negligence shapes more than trivia. For instance, US Postal Service abbreviations cover the territories, but few mainlanders recognize them. GU for Guam, AS for American Samoa, almost never seen in everyday mail. Many people seeing 97,099 Guam assume international postage applies. The confusion runs deep enough that mapping apps sometimes miscategorize territorial addresses as foreign. That's the power of cartographic omission. Absence becomes disbelief. Cultural education amplifies it. Hollywood films use Hawaii as shorthand for farthest America because it's still relatable, tropical yet tourist accessible. Mention Guam or Saipan and viewers file them under overseas. The storyline requires neat borders, not continuity. But the truth is global. You can travel east from Texas, cross the Atlantic to the Virgin Islands, continue around Africa and Asia, and meet American soil again, approaching the Pacific from the opposite side. This layout makes the US one of only a handful of countries spanning the world's widest ocean longitudinally. The continental myth of a self-contained rectangle hides an empire formed as a scatter of anchors across waters. Speaking of the Virgin Islands, they sit in the Caribbean, culturally Caribbean but politically bifurcated between British and American administrations. The US portion, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix adds another tropical limb to America's map. Like Puerto Rico, these islands grant U.S. citizenship without full representation. They expand America's reach into another ocean while exposing another blind spot. Most mainlanders can't locate them even on a globe labeled in English. Their omission from cartographic prominence fosters ignorance that carries political weight. Areas unseen are areas underserved. There's also the dynamic idea of insular areas, a phrase bureaucrats use for all non-state U.S. territories. The term itself implies marginality, something tucked away and small. But collectively, these sites form nearly 5 million square miles of oceanic space once exclusive economic zones are included. Alaska may be the grand visual giant, yet these small dots multiply across a maritime footprint equal to continental mass. When you count them, America's actual borderlines rival entire hemispheres. Oceanic jurisdiction even includes formerly disputed banks and reefs. Navasser Island near Haiti, for instance, an uninhabited speck once central to guano mining in the 180s. It remains under U.S. claim, though Cuba and Haiti have protested at times. On maps, it barely registers, but legally it helps define Caribbean navigation routes. Across the world, similar ghost territories pepper the sea like geographic afterthoughts. Wake Island, used for aircraft refueling, Johnston Atoll, site of chemical weapon disposal, and Palmyra Atoll, the only incorporated U.S. territory without a state affiliation, effectively privately owned yet under federal law. Together, they reveal how America's outer geography reads like historical sediment, from whaling to war to science. So when people say, from sea to shining sea, they underestimate. It's more like from sea to sea, and then more seas afterward. The national outline on a classroom wall captures maybe half of U.S. space. The rest floats thousands of miles away, ignored until headlines mention typhoons or naval drills. Yet the daily sunrise first touches U.S. soil at Guam and last leaves it at American Samoa, a single country spanning an entire calendar day. Educational neglect compounds the illusion of completeness. Ask most citizens how many territories America holds, and answers wobble between 0 and 2. The actual figure, counting inhabited and uninhabited lands, tops a dozen. The mistake persists because these names vanish from mass-produced globes after publishers realize tiny dots clutter design. Cartography, again, edits reality for readability, but what slips off the page also slips from collective awareness. If you can't see it, it's easy to believe it doesn't matter. Yet global context forces reconsideration. International diplomacy, climate monitoring, and undersea cable routes all depend on those scattered possessions. In environmental terms, they create stepping stones for migratory species. In strategic terms, they anchor oceanic influence across hemispheres. The United States, farthest western reef, sits closer to Asia than to Hawaii, meaning military and ecological policy must think planet-wide even when citizens imagine continental containment. In effect, America is both huge and fragmented, a patchwork empire pretending to be a compact republic. All these hidden reaches prove a simple truth. The map we memorize at school lies not by malice, but by convenience. It wants symmetry, simplicity, and closure. But accuracy would mean a sprawl of tiny labels across 2/3 of Earth's oceans, messy, complicated, undeniably real. The illusion that 50 states complete the map comforts us, yet it erases much of what the American flag actually covers. The next time you picture the United States framed neatly between Canada and Mexico, remember there's another half of the nation out beyond that frame, where U.S. jurisdiction meets coral, ice, and open horizon. With those hidden pieces revealed, one final truth stands out. The great American map that doesn't exist. Here's the truth behind all 50 myths. America's map was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to look complete. Real geography never holds still. Coastlines erode, rivers wander, borders shift, and every line we thought we understood keeps rewriting itself. Those classroom grids we trusted were snapshots of a moving world, comforting illusions of order over constant change. Geography isn't just about coordinates, it's about perception. The maps we memorized shaped how we see identity, direction, and even power. Once you start questioning those shapes, you see how every fact carries intention. So here's the challenge. Now that you know the truth, which of these geography lies shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments below. And if your sense of wonder's still spinning, make sure to subscribe. Our next deep dive, 50 World Geography Lies You Still Believe, will take you beyond borders you didn't even know existed. We've only just started redrawing the world.